All right, everybody. It's 1:02, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. And if others pop on, they can certainly go back and look at the recording because this is recorded. Again, welcome to Glad You Asked, and we have an interesting topic today where we'll be talking about material facts. What a hot topic. And before we jump right in, I gotta say this. I know a lot of you are missing my partner in crime who would typically be here, and that's Tiffany. So I don't know if anybody misses her as much as me, I tell you. It really hit me today during because today is Glad You Asked, so I'm used to having Tiffany here. But I promise you, I hope not to let you down. I really hope not. I hope not to let you down, but we're going to jump right in. You all know that we typically go through a few policies in the very beginning of Glad You Asked. However, I am going to forego that this time, and we'll pick up with policies on the next one. And the reason why I'm doing that is because I want to allow as much time for material fact discussion as we need. So I want to jump right in. But before I do, I have a question. Do any of you have any questions now about material facts? I want to make sure we get those covered, or at least talk about it during today's session. Any questions about material facts before we get started? All right. Okay, because it's only one, I'm going to do my best to check the chat. But if I miss something in the chat and you see it, let me know. I would appreciate it. If all of you can help keep your eyes on the chat as we're going through. I tell you, I really feel like these are my teaching days. I feel like I am in pre-licensing where we talk and cover a lot about material facts. Just bear with me here. I want to make sure. There we go. That's better. All right. So because I feel like I'm in my teaching days, I have created a presentation just going back to the basics of material facts. You all may say when you see my presentation, well, Teresa, we already know this. But I tell you, there's nothing wrong with review. Even I need review every now and then. So if you just give me a second, I will put up my presentation so we can get back to the basics. Material Facts 101. All right, so here we go. Share. I'm going to start my presentation. Yep, desktop 2. Okay. Can you all now see my screen? Fabulous. Wonderful. All right. I am going to move this over there. Get this out of my way. All right. And what I want to do is here. All right. Can everyone still see my screen? There. Fabulous. All right, so we're going to talk about material facts. And here's what we want to talk about today. And after we get through the basics, do we tell? The question is to tell or not to tell. That's the question as it relates to us as brokers. So that's what we will talk about today. All right, so let's talk about what material facts are. Material facts covers 4 areas. Number 1, material facts are about the property itself. Now, I'm just going to go down the list because in the presentation, we're going to delve into each one in a little bit more detail. Number 2, material facts are relating directly to the property. Okay. So number 1 is about the property itself. Number 2 is information relating directly to the property. Number 3 is information relating to the ability of principals to act in the transaction. And last, but certainly not least, is information that is of specific importance to your client. Okay. All right. Number 1, information about the property itself. Number 2, information relating directly to the property. Number 3, information relating to the ability of principals to act or perform in the transaction. And number 4, information that is of specific importance to your client. All right, so let's talk about material facts about the property itself. That means significant physical characteristics such as unpermitted space, okay? Also, an example is a structural defect. If something is going on with the piers of the property, something that affects the structure of the property, a defect, or it can be a defective mechanical system, okay? Something wrong with the system. Yes, Mike, I see your hand raised.
So my question would be about unpermitted space.
Okay.
So let's say we run into a situation where the seller isn't aware of anything. Tax card obviously shows something much less in square footage, or I mean, because we run across this stuff all the time, right? What recourse or what actions do we need to take? And I know this isn't about that, but so if you want to refer back to and get back with me later on that, but what are some things that we can do to fix that situation?
Okay, and you're right, Mike, this does happen quite a bit, and we've actually seen it here recently where there was some, there wasn't a permit obtained for a somewhat of a rehab that a seller did. So in those particular cases, and I will say it's good to go back and look at the Alamance County, I can't remember her name, but the representative that came and talked about that. But when that happens, if it's something that's unpermitted, that goes back to what we can discover. Now, as Mike mentioned, we can certainly measure the property and see what the county says it's much less than what we've calculated. Well, after we double check our numbers and still see that the space or the square footage is a lot more than what the county says, then that may require picking up the phone and calling the county. Now, of course, we're going to ask more questions to the seller as well and see what the seller can tell us if they know or have any information about that. But that goes along with our duty to discover. Once we know that greater square footage here, the county says something different, then let's uncover that. Let's go to the county, see what they have. So we can start there in that particular case. Now, Mike, I know you asked about recourse, and what exactly was your question? What recourse do we have?
Well, I mean, what can the buyer ask us or the buyer's agent ask a seller to do to fix that situation? I mean, whether the seller knew about it or not. I mean, I guess that's regardless, you know, whether they have knowledge or no knowledge. But just what is the seller? I mean, obviously the county can be called in and do some sort of an inspection, I guess, or the municipal or city or whoever.
Right. And I'll tell you, Mike, we have that situation going on right now, and it actually resulted in a complaint where something was not permitted. And it actually was, by the listing agent, disclosed that it was not permitted. It was disclosed. However, what they did was the seller actually went to the county to see if they could make a permit retro. So the county did their investigations. Now I'm gonna tell you, the county ended up after the fact, after the buyer closed on the property, the county came back and said, no, we cannot go back and make the permit retro. And oh, by the way, seller, I'm sorry, oh, by the way, new buyer, you have to tear it down.
Oh.
Now, yeah, yes, they were told that. So here's what, in that particular situation, here's what I would done differently. As a listing agent, I would have waited until a definitive answer was received from the planning or zoning department. I would have waited for a definitive answer before I even marketed the property. I would have taken the listing, I would have gotten the paperwork, but I would have postponed the marketing of it until a definitive answer was made. Now, I will say this, one place where the seller could have not gone to the county, right? The seller could have just said, okay, it's unpermitted. I'm telling you it's unpermitted. We did some work. We did not get permits. There you go, listing agent. Now, the listing agent could have very well have marketed that. Here's the property for sale. And oh, by the way, it's unpermitted space. No permits were given or received. Now, that really would have gone back to caveat emptor, buyer beware, because the buyer would have had at that point a choice to decide if they wanted to move forward or not.
And then you would, I mean, obviously we would, as a buyer agent, recommend our buyer go through that retro process to see what would have to be done. And if it would have to been, well, okay, yeah, okay. That makes sense.
Yes, exactly. So one of two things could have been done. Yeah, either don't find out and just disclose that it's no permits, unpermitted, or wait until a definitive answer was given. Yep. That help, Mike?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, awesome, awesome, awesome. All right, any other questions before we move on talking about material facts? Okay, so next slide. I think we're on number 3, material facts relating directly to the property. We may be on number 2. So this means, and this is usually factors outside the property that may directly affect the property's value, the property's use, or desirability of the property. And here's an example, such as a pending zoning change or a planned highway construction in the immediate vicinity. Now, I know a lot of times we may not even check or call zoning because, you know, we don't see any construction around. So we may just naturally think there's no construction coming. But we've seen, and I've seen some case studies where that was actually the case, where some, it didn't appear that there was going to be any construction, but it was already made public by the zoning department that there would be some construction in the future. And the buyer, the current owner, found that out, and they were able to go back and, you know, take some action there. And I won't get into that. However, that's something that we're supposed to do. And I'd like to know how many people call zoning before they list the property?
It depends.
It depends.
Yeah.
Good answer, Mike. It depends. Or how many people who are buyers agents who are representing buyers call planning or zoning to see if there's anything in their 3-year, 5-year, 10-year plans coming?
I'll admit it, not on a regular basis. I don't think as much as I should.
Exactly. Well, I'm the same, Mike. I mean, even in regular practice, that's something we just don't think about on a regular basis. But I tell you, I've seen some case studies where it did become an issue because there was, I think, some highways coming right in front or nearby the property, and it was an issue for that buyer. I seen another raised hand, Joyce.
Is there, can we check with that on a website or do you have to call?
Sure, you can check a website. It's going to depend on what the city or the county, each city or county makes available on their website. Some, a lot, will put out their 5-10-year plans for the city and for the county. The thing with that though, Joyce, if you go online and look at the information that's posted, you have to read through a lot of it. You know, you have to sift through a lot of the information. Sometimes it's just easier to pick up the phone, call planning or zoning and give them the address, and they're able to do the work for you.
I like that a lot better.
Yep. Saves time. Definitely
So,
saves time.
To follow up with that,
Yes.
let's say it's a highway, but it's out in the northern or southern part of the county, not necessarily especially in Alamance County, where there, maybe the state that has said this is what's going to happen, right? I mean, I don't know of any projects right now that are going to be going on, but we had for the longest time the Cook Road bypass or the University Drive, which is what is the University Drive now. We had to disclose that, because it was coming and we knew it was coming.
Right.
But would you have to call? I guess the state may be another resource to call on, and I mean, just ask the question. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good one, Mike. And maybe that is something I'm hoping at some point, and that's a good question, because at what point does it come down to the city and county level? If it's a state thing, it eventually has to pass down to the city or county level. That's a very good question, but that may very well need to be a step, an extra step in there. Absolutely. But I will say this, and this information was taken directly from the North Carolina Real Estate Commission pre-licensing handbook. And if you look at the slide here, it says construction in the immediate vicinity. I know that's broad, but immediate could be 1 mile, half a mile, 2 miles. It's a very broad description, but it does say immediate vicinity. So I would venture to say if it gets too far away, then we may not have a duty to disclose. It's a good question.
However, CYA would be to, even if it's 5 miles out, just say it's approximately 5 miles from, right?
Exactly. And I love that CYA, because a buyer could come back and say, well, that's the route that I take to work, or that's the route that I use on a regular basis. So it would have been good to know. Absolutely. I like that. Saying, although it's not immediate, it's within a 10-mile, 5-mile radius, and here's what's coming. I like it. Good suggestion. And I'm always about CYA, as Tiffany would say, covering our assets. All right, moving along. Okay, still talking about and defining material facts. Material facts that are relating directly to the ability of the agent's principal to act. So this is the ability of the agent's principal to complete the transaction. And we know this can fall on either the buyer or the seller, right? So an example is pending foreclosure sale. That would be on the seller side. Or a buyer's inability to qualify for financing. Maybe they qualified at the beginning of the contract or at the time of contract, but they went out and bought a new F-150. And now that $700, $800 car payment is now throwing them out of qualification. Well, that's material fact that we need to disclose.
So
all right.
I hate to be the only one talking, but
no, I like it, Mike.
So I have a situation, we're actually closing on the property tomorrow, that there's another piece of land that's adjacent to the one that we're closing on, that the application has been made to Alamance County Planning and Zoning,
Okay.
but it had not been approved for a subdivision that their road going up into this 11 lot subdivision was being cut in, but nothing was approved. Now, we
Okay.
did disclose that,
Mhm.
and it actually discouraged one buyer from moving forward with,
Ah.
with an offer.
Okay. Okay.
Because we don't know, one thing we don't know is what's being built,
Mhm.
and that was a little bit of a concern, so.
Yeah. So I like that because it's falls right in line with number 4 here. What your example falls right in line with this one. Information that's of specific importance. So let's talk about that. So facts known to be of specific importance to, that's supposed to say to a party. Most likely to be items of special interest to a purchaser's intended use of the property, such as zoning allowing a home or business or covenants allowing multiple pets. What the example Mike just gave falls right in line with this. Would it affect a principal's decision to purchase the property? And obviously, that did for one of the buyers. Knowing that information, they would rather have not had anything to do with this new potential subdivision coming. So yes, Mike, letting that information be known and disclosing that was a CYA moment. Even though it's not approved, it could be. That's the thing. And you gave the buyer the opportunity to make a choice and decide.
Well, and what's interesting about that is the seller had given us other information that didn't match up with what was actually applied for. He thought it was only a 6 lot subdivision, ended up being an 11 lot subdivision. So it made a little bit of a difference that way as well.
It did. Thanks for adding that, Mike, because that does make a big difference. And here's the thing, even when our sellers tell us something, do we have a duty to verify the seller's information? Absolutely. Absolutely. It's now that we know, we have a duty to discover it, get some facts and disclose it. Absolutely. Very good. All right, moving right along. All right, so now that we know what material facts are, I want to now switch gears into what brokers cannot do. A broker's, according to the North Carolina Real Estate Commission, these are prohibited acts of a broker. And you all know this. Again, I told you this in the beginning, this would be pre-licensing 101. Willful misrepresentation. That is intentionally misinforming any party involved in a transaction about a material fact. And notice that it says any party, not just your client, but or not just the other client, but all parties involved with that transaction. So willful misrepresentation is intentionally misinforming. So therefore, negligent misrepresentation would be unintentionally misinforming any party involved in the transaction about a material fact. That's one of those mistakes. I didn't intend to leave it out, but nevertheless, the commission frowns upon it and says, okay, well, we'll just put that in the category of negligence. All right. Prohibited acts continue. Willful omission, intentionally failing to disclose a material fact to any party involved in a transaction. So that's intentionally not disclosing a material fact. So therefore, negligent omission is unintentionally failing to disclose a material fact. All of that are prohibited acts. We have a duty to discover and disclose. So what do we do? Now that we know what material facts are, what is our job as agents on what we are to disclose? Now, I know a lot of you have been to or have taken your Gen Up or Big Up this year, and there was a lot of discussion, so I've heard, about material facts. And I believe one of the ones that was that was brought up maybe a couple weeks ago in team meeting was, what about those brown spots on a ceiling when we're in the property? Anybody recall that discussion, or was any of you here in that particular CE class where that was discussed? Anybody here? How about that? Okay, no problem. So what I'm going to do is I had to do a lot of research for this particular class because I like to say exactly what the commission says. So if you give me 1 second, I'm going to share my screen again, and I am going to actually put up the North Carolina Real Estate Commission's blurb about those brown spots on the ceiling. All right. Here we go. So can you all see the highlight in yellow here? All right, well, Mike, since you are doing such a wonderful job with asking questions, do you mind reading the highlighted section here?
Sure. Agents have an affirmative duty to discover and disclose material facts to all transactional parties, not just the broker's clients. Examples of transactional parties include buyers and sellers, landlords and tenants, and even lenders. This obligation suggests that licensees must make appropriate disclosures even if consumers do not ask direct questions. As an illustration, when a broker notices something amiss, such as water stains on a ceiling, the broker must take the appropriate steps to determine if the water stain suggests an active leak. As another example, a buyer customer may not know about planned highway construction near a property she is interested in, even though she makes no inquiry about highway construction. A broker must offer this information to the consumer. The duty to disclose material facts to a third party applies to seller's agents working with the buyer, or buyer's agents as well as buyer agent working with a seller or seller's agent.
Very good, very good. Thank you, Mike.
You're welcome.
So going back to the stains on the ceiling. So it's not that we as agents or brokers need to say, oh, there's a brown stain or potential, what looks like water stains on the ceiling. What we're to do, as it says here, take the appropriate steps to determine if the water stain suggests a leak. And what's one way we do that as a buyer's agent, or even as a seller's agent? What's one way we do that? Are we roofers, or can we get up there to, what do we do? What can we do?
So the first thing I do is ask the seller,
Okay.
if it's, if the roof was put on in 2022, is that a stain that's prior to the roof being put on? Is that why the roof was replaced? If they don't have any knowledge of it, then definitely time to look at hiring a roofer.
Exactly. I like it. Thank you, Mike. So that goes back to discover and disclose. That goes back to our duty to discover. Ask questions. Now, we cannot control what a seller or buyer says to us. However, that's a good place to start. A good place to start. We're going to ask questions. If we kind of feel like, okay, it was answered, it wasn't answered, is that something as an agent, especially as a listing agent, that we're willing to do? Are we willing to hire a roofer, or can we suggest to the seller? Can they provide receipts or proof of the roof repair or the installation of the roof? Can they provide that in case we are asked? We can provide that documentation. So asking questions and making suggestions on good routes to take, but making sure we're doing our part to discover and disclose. And this last part of that goes back to Mike's example earlier about construction being nearby. Even if our client doesn't ask, but we have information on nearby construction or things happening close by about the property, we are to disclose it anyway, even if we are not asked directly about it. Questions so far? Comments?
What about our taking a moisture meter reading ourselves?
Okay. As long as you can sufficiently operate the equipment and document, absolutely.
Alice, thank you for asking that, because I have a moisture meter myself that I do know how to operate.
And is it one with pins or not? I mean, I've thought about buying one, so for this same reason, you know what I mean?
Well, I bought the one that has the reader on the back of the unit. I wish I would have bought the ones with the pins, but mine reads it pretty good.
Okay. So that's an issue too, you know, how accurate is our equipment, but
Right.
True.
Exactly.
just disclaimer, I guess, with that too, but.
Right.
And I'm sorry I'm on here late, but going back to prohibited acts,
Yes.
intentional and unintentional, well,
Mhm.
how does one know that? Neither of them are acceptable, however, correct?
Exactly. Well, you know, willful, meaning you intentionally, and of course, it has to go back to what can be proven. For instance, if a seller sends us an email, maybe we ask them a question through email or through text that says, do you know, I saw brown, I'll use the brown spots again. I saw brown spots on the ceiling as I was walking through. Is this any indication of an active leak or a past leak or something like that? And the seller actually says yes to us. Yes, it is. And we were going to get the roof fixed. We had somebody out, we were going to, but decided to sell, and we just simply didn't do it. Now we have that information. And if we do not disclose that, then that is willful. We intentionally didn't tell it because we thought it probably would affect a buyer wanting to buy it, but we intentionally left that out.
Well, I had a circumstance where I just to everybody, I'm so glad I had it in writing. My seller told me she had replaced an HVAC unit in 2018, and I put that in the MLS because that's what she told me. And the unit was not in an easy area to access. I don't know that you can't always find a sticker on these things anyway. Do you know what I mean? For me to go check it.
Right.
So I took her at her word. I didn't say give me a receipt. Maybe I should have said that. But guess what? She later said, oh, I don't know where you got that from. When I said, when it was inspected and the unit turned out to be 20 years old. And I said, well, in writing in an email you sent me. So that covered my butt with her at any rate. But still, it was like, oh God. And so then I had to back up and change the MLS. And then, you know, we had to deal with it because there were issues with that HVAC. So anyway, but to the willful and intentional, and the example that we discussed personally today, I had the same inspector inspect a house at there's the seller when he bought it, and the seller misrepresented that there was nothing the matter with plumbing, windows, and whatever. And they're all the same issues that were pointed out by this inspector when he inspected it 7 years ago or whatever it was. So, I mean, do they care that it's intent? I mean, forgetting is one thing, but still he had the knowledge. At some point he was told these things are not working.
Yeah. So the difference being, thank you for sharing that, Alice. The difference being the seller versus the agent. That's the difference. Did the seller tell it, or maybe the seller forgot? The other thing is, did the listing agent have knowledge of it? That's who the real estate commission is going to govern. Not so much the seller. If the seller misrepresents, that's going to have to be dealt with civilly. But the commission governs the licensee. So if the listing agent had knowledge of it and didn't share it, then that's where we get into that willful versus negligent. Whether
Okay.
it's misrepresented or omitted. Yeah.
Right. So for instance, this had a lot of fogged windows. That's something the agent maybe should, I mean, if I were her, I would have had to have said to any potential buyers, even though not disclosed on the seller disclosure, there are windows that are not, the seals are broken.
Right.
That's the
Exactly.
sort of thing one as a listing agent should be disclosing, correct?
Right. Yes,
Okay.
and should see, if they're there when they are, operating the windows or just checking those things. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Our
Okay.
due
I mean, it's
diligence-
pretty obvious, but I don't fault, but it's to know that I'm responsible for that in the future is good to know. So
Yes.
thank you. Appreciate
Yes,
it.
ma'am. Very good. I see Judy, I see Carrie, I see Joyce. So I think I saw you first, Judy.
Okay, I've got two questions. So where a property has been used for an investment property with a tenant in it, just to check myself, the okay answers on the disclosure are all no representation.
Okay.
Is that correct?
For the seller, that
The
may be
seller.
the case. Yes.
So sellers had tenants in there for years. She might have had a pre-inspection and learned
Mhm.
some things
Okay.
from what the home inspector told her, but still, she didn't live in it. She doesn't have firsthand knowledge of those things from having lived in it. Is it
Okay.
still legit to answer no representation all the way down?
Yep. So, and that's a good one. Good question, Judy. Thank you for asking that. Here's the thing. Based on the property disclosure that is written by the North Carolina Real Estate Commission, so no representation is kind of like saying, I don't know, or I'm not saying, okay? So no representation. That's what I plead the fifth, or I don't know. Here's what a seller is not supposed to do. They are not supposed to conceal information. They're not supposed to hide it, if that makes sense. So saying no representation is okay for that seller. They just cannot conceal something.
Well, okay, so then what do they do? I mean, they haven't lived in it.
Mhm.
They maybe learned about some stuff through a home inspection. They're not covering it up.
Mhm.
So when you say not conceal, it's out there for the buyer to discover on their own. Do they have an obligation to plaster it in the face of the buyer and say, here, I know this about my property and you need to know it as well? Or, I mean, where is that line?
So let's remember, when it comes to the governing of material facts, the commission is going to govern the licensee. They're going to govern the broker. So it's hard for us, and we can't control what the seller shares. However, we, having the duty to discover and disclose, can ask questions. If I, as a listing agent, know that a seller, and they can put no representation, they can check it all the way down. but maybe they told me about this inspection that they had maybe a couple months ago. Oh, well, now I know that you had an inspection, and maybe they shared it, maybe they did not. I would then do some more digging to discover, did the report reveal anything? Is there anything major going on? Documenting what the seller's answers are to me as an agent. And if, again, I would ask, would you share that with me? If they say no, then you now have information that the seller did have a pre-list or had an inspection done on the property, but you don't have any knowledge because it wasn't shared with you of what the report found.
So we then would do best when our clients are having a pre-inspection and not necessarily intending to address things, to make sure we are not provided with a copy of their pre-inspection report. Is that true?
It's hard to say, and I'll tell you why. It's going to depend a lot on how each agent runs their business. And I will tell you, Judy, for me personally, I am a firm believer of pre-list inspections. I'm a firm believer. That's just me. That's not every agent's practice, or that's not how every agent does their business. But I favor pre-list inspections. And I asked the seller for a copy of it. And I asked them, can I make it available? If they so choose to have one, can I make it available to prospective buyers? Most of the time, I haven't had one to say no, and I will. And in those cases, the buyers are actually very appreciative that they, at that point, they're feeling the seller is not hiding anything. They do want me to know if there are any issues. So I'm in favor. That's me. That's Teresa. I'm in favor of pre-list inspections. Based on the listing agreement, that question is there. So that is something that we do need to go over with our clients when we're going through that listing agreement. It's going to be up to them, but it's also up to us to educate them and say, okay, if you have one and you don't share it, if you know anything, I don't want to know. But again, that does not dismiss us from discovering and disclosing. Even if the seller tells us, once you find out something, I don't want you to tell it, we cannot follow that instruction because it's not lawful.
Okay, so my second question is, I don't know if there's any value in this, but I do it for my own sake, and maybe I should take it further. But when I'm creating a listing, I'll send, before I activate it, I'll send it as a draft to the seller, and I'll ask them to go over it for accuracy and edits. And they frequently don't do it thoroughly, I know, because I'll find things that I discover, typos or whatever, that they never found. However, what I'm wondering is, in this age of who knew, they knew and we didn't, or a year, somebody used the example of, they gave you the year of the HVAC and that was inaccurate. Well, if I have an age of an appliance like that I think is a good thing to share, I'll put that right in my remarks. So if my year is off, then, well, it was the seller who told me, right? And I can't always check to make sure their age was correct. Does that give me any kind of, maybe I should have them sign off that, yes, I reviewed your draft for accuracy. Is there any, if I had them do that, would that stand up in court if I got called on something?
Yeah, and having them just reply back to an email would be sufficient, saying, please, acknowledge that you reviewed and approved this information, something to that effect. Absolutely, having that in writing.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. 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 Carrie and Joyce. Good questions, Judy.
So I just wanted to bring up, I had seen I believe it was an email from a home inspector that was sent out. This was just a few days ago, where the home inspector was shocked or in awe, I guess,
Okay.
because he had an agent that stated that when you get the inspection, just send it to the buyer. I don't want to be aware of any material facts. And then the buyer will present it directly to the seller, so I don't have to be aware of anything. And I don't have to share it with anybody.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Very, very interesting.
now
I wonder-
that doesn't work, right?
Right. So my next question, excuse me, my next question would be, did all parties agree to this? And do you have proof of that? That's one thing. And as a realtor, we're not to speak with another realtor's clients unless we have express permission to do so. So that would be my next question. Do they have permission? But again, that does not excuse us as licensees from
Right.
discovering and disclosing
Right.
things we reasonably should have known.
Yeah, I think the inspector was just really kind of, like I said, he was shocked that an agent would say that. I mean, his whole thing was why does this buyer have an agent if they don't want to be involved or want to know the information on an inspection report? I just
Right,
thought
and
that
that's-
was interesting.
Hey,
It is.
Teresa.
Yes.
On
Thank you.
that, I had an agent the other day put me on speakerphone with his client saying,
Okay.
I want to confirm that you do not have any additional material facts about this property that we're looking at.
Interesting. Interesting. And that was the seller's agent, the listing agent that did that?
No, I
Or-
was the listing
Oh, you're the
agent.
listing. Okay. Okay. Wow. I don't know what they hoped to accomplish by that, because sharing information with the buyer's agent is as if you shared it with the buyer. So I don't know the purpose of doing that. How did you handle, I see you, Joyce. How did you handle that, Melissa?
I said, I just need a list of specific questions. I mean, I just go off of the residential property disclosure, right? That's what the seller, I mean, I said, what are you concerned about? And then he brought up something about a railroad tie in landscaping that looked like it had bugs in it.
Oh, wow. Wow. You handled that well, Melissa, because I probably would have said, I will discuss this with you and not on speaker with your client present, would have been my response. Call me when you are alone, or I can call you back another time. Very good. You asked for specifics. I like that.
Well, I mean, we can't answer them. I mean, the seller might can, or I could go out to the property, right? But even if I look at a bug, I don't know if it's a termite. I mean,
Exactly. And right, Melissa, very good. And because that goes back to where it says other professional advice, we are real estate agents. We are not inspectors. We're not attorneys. And it gives this whole long list of industries or expertise that we don't have as real estate agents. So I like your response by giving me a list, let me know what specific questions you have, and I'll get back to you. That was a very nice answer, Melissa, because I probably would have said it differently. I'm not discussing this with you in front of your client. So you handled that well. Very good.
I just wonder if some of this is coming up in these classes.
It sounds like it.
That's what I was
sounds like
kind of questioning.
It sounds like it, Melissa. It really does. And You know, and I was just looking at something that said all of the most common questions and issues of 2021. I tell you, I am going to get with Tiffany now that she's there, and I'm going to ask her on the consumer side if she will tell us what they are really seeing at the commission for 2022. I think it would be very educational and helpful to share that and, you know, get a little bit more education in those areas as real estate agents. Yep. Thanks, Melissa. Joyce, I didn't forget you.
Thank you. So two things. One is, so when you say disclose these things, do you mean in the listing, in the additional forms or agent remarks? Is that where you're talking about doing that?
Yes, you can certainly put them in the MLS under the agent remarks. I'm so glad they added that. That was not always there. It's been there for a while now, but not always. So I'm glad they added that section specifically for agents. And even if someone calls, you have a listing, even if a potential buyer calls who is not represented by an agent and may not be represented at the time, then we still have a duty to disclose it to them as well, because they are not privy to those agent remarks. So that's a great place to put it, but also know that we need to share it in the event a potential buyer calls us directly and may not be privy to that information. Good question.
Okay, and then the second part is I'm glad you mentioned brown spots, because recently I went on a listing appointment and they pointed out some brown spots, and they said, well, they have, you know, we've never had a problem with this in the past, but these showed up. But they're also, they're wanting to put their best foot forward. So they do, I recommended we get a roofer in, let's see what's going on. That way we can share that, you know, we're either going to remedy this or potentially just let them know, and maybe they might want to remedy it if it wasn't a big deal. But then they're talking about possibly painting the ceiling, and I thought, well, we can, I agree, I want to put our best foot forward, but so how would you handle that? I mean, what would you say? We can't like conceal it, but yeah, you don't want a neon sign for it either.
Right. So based on the North Carolina Real Estate Commission, they tell us that a seller cannot conceal. And here's the thing, you now know, therefore you're obligated, you have a duty to disclose that. And it could say something to the effect of, there were 2 brown spots or wet spots in the ceiling. Investigate it, ask questions to the seller. Seller did not hire a roofer or whatever it is to investigate.
Mm-hmm.
You're not a roofer. You are not expected to get up there and figure it out. However, you can disclose that there could be a potential issue.
So as long as we disclose it, can they paint the ceiling?
Well, we can't stop them, can we? We
No.
can tell them that they are not, we can't stop them, but we have a duty to let them know their obligations, which means you should not conceal, because this could be civil if something's found out, you know, it could be handled civilly. Again,
so what if they ask for my recommendation? Should we paint it? And then I would say, I don't know.
I cannot tell you whether or not to paint your ceiling. What I can say to you, if you do paint it, I have a duty to disclose information that I know. If you don't paint it, so you give them their, not so much options, but the consequences of whether or not they do paint or don't paint.
Gotcha.
Yep.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Mike.
Thank you. I'm kind of going to go back to a little bit of Judy's scenario and Melissa's scenario, where Judy had no representation all the way down. and Melissa had a call from an agent. Well, and Melissa had mentioned something about, well, we're going by what they tell us and put on the property disclosure statement. However, I think it goes back to what you said earlier too. If we know of those problems or those issues, then we do have that duty to disclose. And honestly, I asked the question myself of listing agents, if there's anything further they have to disclose or need to disclose to me. Now, I don't have my client on speakerphone when I do that. Granted, I don't want them to hear necessarily everything direct from, because it might be pretty harsh. You just never know, right? But I do ask that question because there are instances where there's not enough room in the agent remarks, or there's nothing disclosed from the disclosure. However, I know about the subdivision going in across the street, right? Or whatever it is, right? And so I think it honestly, it's really why I'm here today too, because material facts can be a slippery slope, right? You just never know what's going to come up, and I'm the opposite end of the spectrum when it comes to pre-listing home inspections right now. I'm telling them, nope, don't do it.
Yes,
don't do it.
and that, yep, and it's pros and cons to both.
And I give them both. I let them know, what the pros and the cons are. But that's me and the way I do my business. And it's kind of interesting how you're completely polar opposite of that. So I guess it goes going back to their scenarios, even though the one put no representation and, do we know of other stuff? That has to be, that should be disclosed. And honestly, that's where the way that subdivision came up is I had failed to put it in the remarks because I hadn't heard anything back.
Okay.
And so I told them, look, what we know is what the seller told us, which is a little bit different than what we found out. So and then of course it made a difference. So
yeah. And thanks for bringing that back up, Mike, because we have to remember that a seller concealing or lying on a property disclosure is handled civilly through a court of law. However, the real estate, we are bound by license law and commission rules of the real estate commission. So when I'm speaking material facts, it's directed towards us as licensees, not the seller. The seller, if they did lie, or if they did conceal, or they answered, truthfully or lied, basically, that's handled civilly. We, on the other hand, have a duty to discover and disclose and tell what we do know if it falls in those 4 categories of material fact. If we just remember that, give the seller their options, and really in that section on the property disclosures, that paragraph 1, 2, and 3, where it explains what yes means, no means, and no representation means. If we just really hone in on that, the seller should be fairly clear on their duties of sharing information about the property. But as it goes for us, we have a duty to discover and disclose.
Can I say
Judy?
one thing? Okay,
Yes,
I'm almost out of time. There's some software that we're using that if agents aren't, they probably want to look into, that Seller Shield.
Yes.
That really talks directly to the seller, and it explains in pretty strong language the importance of answering the right way. So we put that in front of our sellers, and we feel like that's done a good job of kind of, maybe not scaring them into, but encouraging them to be as honest as they can be.
Absolutely. I like that, Judy. I have heard of that, and I think they called me and wanted to do like a demo or something, but I never did it. I just didn't have the time. So I'll look back at that. Thank you for bringing that up. Seller Shield. Thank you.
Seller
for-
Shield, yeah.
Thank you for that. Okay, well, we are out of time. This was really good discussion, and I feel like we could go another hour talking about material facts. But one thing I do want to remind everyone is that the Real Estate Commission governs us as licensees. We put the information in front of the seller, explain the property disclosure, and they have a choice of how they should or how they will respond. We, however, need to tell them, regardless of how you respond on this property disclosure, because we are buyer beware state, if I know I legally have to share and disclose this information to all parties of the transaction. All right. I gotta leave it there because it's 2:03 and I respect your time. Everyone, thank you so much for coming. I know we'll probably have to do this again, and we will. But I want to thank you all for being here this Thursday talking about material facts, and I am so glad you asked. See you next time, everybody.
Thank you, Teresa.
Thank
Alrighty.
you.
Thanks.